In the frozen, blood-soaked winter of 1942, the skies over the Eastern Front belonged to a single, ruthless master. The German Luftwaffe was the undisputed apex predator of industrial warfare. They flew sleek, metal beasts, monsters of engineering like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. These machines were designed for one relentless purpose: to hunt, to destroy, and to dominate. Their engines roared with over 1,000 horsepower, tearing through the frozen sky at speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour. For the battered, freezing Soviet Red Army, the sound of an approaching German engine was not just a warning, it was an absolute death sentence. The Reich's air supremacy was absolute, fueled by high-octane gasoline, thick armor plating, and the arrogant certainty of unstoppable victory. But then, out of the gray, ash-choked mists of the Caucasus came a machine so primitive, so laughably outdated that German soldiers initially thought it was a practical joke. It was not a weapon of modern steel. It was a relic of a bygone era, held together by wire, wood glue, and desperation. This was the Polikarpov Po-2. To call it a combat aircraft was an insult to the term. It was a basic, open-cockpit biplane, originally designed in 1928 as an agricultural crop duster and a trainer for novice civilian pilots. Its wings were not made of duralumin, but light, splintering spruce wood, covered in nothing more than tightly stretched cotton canvas coated in cheap lacquer. If you punctured it with a finger, it would rip. If a stray tracer bullet touched its skin, the entire machine would transform into a flying, screaming inferno. The technical specifications of this flying kite were an absolute embarrassment to the standards of World War II aviation. The Po-2's 5-cylinder radial engine put out a measly 110 horsepower, barely more than a modern family sedan. Its top speed was a pathetic 94 miles per hour. To put that into perspective, the aircraft was so slow that its absolute maximum speed was actually lower than the stalling speed of the very German fighters sent to destroy it. It was a flying target. It had no armor plating to protect the crew, no self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent catastrophic fires, and no radio to call for help. It was a machine that belonged in a museum, not on the front lines of the most brutal war in human history. Yet it was this exact fragile toy that would become the most feared weapon in the Soviet arsenal. The secret did not lie in the wood and canvas, but in the iron will of who was sitting in the cockpit. These planes were flown exclusively by the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, an all-female unit of volunteers, many of whom were teenage girls who had lied about their age to fight for their dying nation. Led by the legendary pilot Marina Ryskova, these young women were handed the keys to these obsolete crop dusters and told to do the impossible: take the fight to the heart of the German war machine. They operated in the dead of night, in temperatures so bone-chillingly cold that touching the metal of their engine with a bare hand would instantly rip the skin from their fingers. At first, the seasoned veterans of the German Wehrmacht laughed. When they heard the unmistakable cuff, cuff, cuff of the Po-2's tiny engine overhead, they mocked it. They called it the neigh machine, the sewing machine. It was an annoyance, a minor nuisance to be brushed aside by their state-of-the-art anti-aircraft guns. But the laughter did not last. The Germans soon realized that these women were not flying haphazardly. They were conducting a calculated, relentless campaign of psychological warfare. The young Soviet pilots understood their aircraft's limitations, and with sheer icy brilliance, they turned those very limitations into devastating tactical advantages. To survive the gauntlet of German searchlights and deadly flak, the pilots of the 588th devised a tactic of suicidal bravery. As they approached their targets, they did not fly in roaring and firing. Instead, several kilometers away from the German lines, they cut their engines to idle. The sputtering stopped. The engine went dead silent. In that terrifying instant, the Po-2 ceased to be an airplane and became a ghost, a heavy, unpowered wooden glider slipping silently through the freezing night sky. The only warning the German infantrymen shivering in their trenches had was a faint, sinister rustling sound. It was the wind rushing through the wooden struts and canvas wings. To the terrified German infantrymen shivering in their trenches, that soft whispering hiss of wood and fabric sounded exactly like a broomstick sweeping through the air. It was a sound that meant death was already on its way, falling silently from the clouds. Before the searchlights could find them, before the anti-aircraft guns could even rotate, the bombs would release. Boom! Munition dumps disintegrated. Command tents vanished in sheets of fire. Sleeping soldiers were torn to pieces in their beds. By the time the Germans could even raise their weapons, the silent gliders had restarted their tiny engines with a sudden cough, climbing back into the protective womb of the night. This was not strategic warfare. It was unadulterated psychological torture. The pilots of the 588th would fly up to 15 or 18 missions a single night, denying the German invaders the one thing they desperately needed to survive the brutal Russian campaign: sleep. The constant, agonizing paranoia of the silent death from above drove hardened veterans to the brink of madness. This is the story of how an obsolete piece of wood and canvas, flown by teenage girls with no radar, no defensive armor, and not even a parachute, broke the spirit of the mightiest army on Earth. This is the story of the legendary Nachthexen, the Night Witches. To truly understand how this wood and string relic terrified the German army, we have to look back to its inception in 1928. The designer, Nikolai Polikarpov, never built this aircraft to fight in a global war of industrial annihilation. He designed it to sow seeds, to carry mail across the vast Soviet wilderness, and to serve as a forgiving trainer for novice civilian pilots. Polikarpov's design philosophy was simple: make it cheap, make it rugged, and make it idiot-proof. He was working under the intense pressure of the early Soviet state, a regime that would later imprison him in a sharashka, a special prison laboratory for perceived political failures. In this environment, survival meant creating a machine that could be built in any furniture factory by unskilled labor using local materials. Polikarpov succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, but in doing so, he created a design that seemed hopelessly obsolete by the time Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. The anatomy of the Polikarpov Po-2 was a testament to extreme minimalism. Its structural frame was crafted from Russian spruce and Baltic pine, glued together with casein adhesives. Over this wooden skeleton, workers stretched nothing but a thin layer of percale, a lightweight cotton fabric, which was then painted with layers of flammable nitrocellulose lacquer to make it taut and waterproof. The aircraft was held together by high-tension piano wire, which whistled softly in the wind. The instrument panel was practically prehistoric. There were no advanced gyro compasses, no artificial horizons, and absolutely no fuel gauges. To see how much gasoline remained in the tank, the pilot had to look directly through the windshield at a primitive external glass tube protruding from the engine cowl. There were no hydraulics to assist the pilot, only steel cables running from the joystick directly to the canvas-covered control surfaces. At the nose of this wooden kite sat its heartbeat, the Shvetsov M11. This was a 5-cylinder air-cooled radial engine producing a meager 110 horsepower. It was an engine designed for reliability over performance, running comfortably on the lowest grade, most contaminated fuel available, or even kerosene in a pinch. Because the engine had no cowling, its cylinders were completely exposed to the elements, making maintenance remarkably easy, but creating an incredibly loud, unrefined rattling noise. While the German engines hummed with the smooth, high RPM precision of advanced engineering, the M11 clattered like a mechanical skeleton. German soldiers on the ground mocked this sound endlessly, comparing it to the rapid, rhythmic tick-tick-tick of a domestic sewing machine. To the German High Command, this design was an absolute joke. In 1942, Willy Messerschmitt's Bf-109 was the absolute pinnacle of high-velocity aerial combat. Its liquid-cooled, supercharged V-12 engine boasted over 1,400 horsepower. The Luftwaffe lived and died by a doctrine of overwhelming kinetic energy. Their pilots were trained to utilize boom and zoom tactics, climbing to extreme altitudes, diving on targets at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, firing their heavy cannons and zooming back up into the clouds. Speed was their ultimate weapon, their armor, and their pride. They believed that any aircraft that could not keep pace with their high-performance fighters was merely a target waiting to be destroyed. But they had overlooked a fundamental rule of aerodynamics, one that turned the Po-2's pathetic speed into its ultimate shield. Every aircraft has a stall speed, the minimum speed at which the wings can generate enough lift to support the weight of the plane. If an aircraft flies slower than its stall speed, the airflow separates from the wing, lift collapses, and the plane plunges toward the earth. For a heavily armed, metal-clad German Messerschmitt, this critical stall speed was roughly 75 to 80 miles per hour. If a Luftwaffe pilot attempted to slow his machine down below this point to target a slower opponent, his fighter would stall, roll violently, and spin out of control. The Polikarpov Po-2, however, weighed almost nothing. Its massive dual-wing surface area distributed its weight so efficiently that its stall speed was practically non-existent, a mind-boggling 31 miles per hour. This meant the Po-2 could float through the air at a crawl, maintaining absolute control and maneuverability at speeds that would make any modern German fighter drop like a stone. Nikolai Polikarpov's crop duster was, quite literally, too slow to be shot down by standard means. Imagine the sheer frustration of a highly decorated Luftwaffe experte, an ace with dozens of aerial victories. He spots a Po-2 lumbering over the Russian forest. He dives in for what should be an effortless kill, but as he closes the distance at 300 miles per hour, his window of attack is less than a single second. If he tries to slow down to line up his guns, his cockpit shakes violently as his wings begin to stall. If he maintains his speed, he overshoots the target in the blink of an eye, unable to bring his guns to bear. Meanwhile, the Soviet pilot simply nudges the stick, banking the incredibly agile biplane into a tight turn at treetop level, disappearing behind a hill. The turning radius of the wooden biplane was so impossibly tight that no metal monoplane could ever hope to follow it without slamming straight into the ground. Furthermore, the Po-2 possessed an accidental, highly advanced tactical advantage: materials-based stealth. The German military was beginning to rely heavily on early warning radar systems to detect incoming Allied bombers. These radar systems operated by bouncing radio waves off the metal skins of aircraft, but the Po-2 had no metal skin. It was a flying collection of wood, fabric, and wire. The radio waves of the German radar passed right through the canvas wings and wooden fuselage, reflecting almost nothing back to the receivers. To the high-tech German defense systems, the Po-2 was a ghost, invisible on their screens, bypassing their early warning nets with ease. The Germans had built a high-tech trap, but the Soviets had sent an insect too small and too fragile to be caught in its mesh. As the sun dipped below the frozen horizon of the Eastern Front, the airfields of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment transformed into scenes of quiet, disciplined chaos. There were no concrete runways, no hangars, and no heated barracks. The pilots and their teenage ground crews slept in dugouts, using earth and snow as insulation against the brutal winter. When the call to fly came, the young women emerged into the freezing air, dressed in oversized, hand-me-down men's uniforms stuffed with newspapers to keep out the chill. Among them was Nadezhda Popova, a young Ukrainian pilot who would eventually fly over 800 missions. Popova would later recall that the wind in the open cockpit felt like needles of ice piercing her face, freezing the tears to her cheeks. Yet, despite the numbing cold, the engine heat, and the constant smell of low-grade fuel and heavy grease, these women prepared for a form of aerial warfare that was as poetic as it was suicidal. To understand the sheer audacity of these missions, one must understand the brutal math of the Polikarpov Po-2's payload limits. The Shvetsov engine was so weak that it could only lift a maximum of 300 kilograms of cargo. To the commanders of the 588th, that weight allowance was too precious to be wasted on safety. They faced a grim, uncompromising choice: protect the pilots or maximize the destruction. They chose destruction. Parachutes were completely banned. A parachute weighed roughly 15 kilograms. To carry one meant leaving behind a fragmentation bomb. Radios, too, were stripped from the cockpits to save weight. The pilots flew in absolute radio silence, unable to communicate with their home base or each other once they cleared the runway. They carried no radar, no defensive guns, and no navigation instruments. If they were hit, there was no bailout, no rescue signal, and no second chance. They had only their wooden planes, their hand-drawn maps, and a single, burning purpose. Because a single Po-2 carried a fraction of the payload of a heavy bomber, the 588th had to rely on a relentless, terrifyingly coordinated strategy to survive. They did not attack as a mass formation. Instead, they hunted in groups of 3. This 3-plane cell was a masterpiece of tactical deception, designed to exploit the limitations of German searchlight crews and anti-aircraft gunners. The first 2 biplanes would fly ahead as deliberate, highly visible bait. They would deliberately draw the attention of the German defenses, buzzing loudly over the camp to force the enemy to turn on their powerful searchlights. Once caught in the blinding white glare of the searchlight beams, the first 2 pilots would bank violently, diving and weaving in a desperate, stomach-churning dance to dodge the incoming torrent of 37mm anti-aircraft flak.
It was a terrifying game of chicken. While the German gunners were entirely focused on trying to track and shoot down the 2 twisting, diving decoys, the 3rd plane would slip silently through the darkness of the blind spots. The 3rd pilot, flying at a higher altitude and completely blacked out, had a clear, unobstructed path to the target. But to ensure absolute accuracy and complete surprise, she had to execute the most dangerous maneuver in the 588th's playbook. As she lined up her run, several hundred meters above the oblivious German camp, the pilot's hand would reach for the throttle lever. With a steady, calculated movement, she would cut the engine to a dead idle. In an instant, the mechanical rattle of the sewing machine disappeared. The Po-2 was no longer an airplane. It was a silent, predatory glider dropping gracefully and invisibly through the freezing night. The pilot guided the wooden structure entirely by feel, listening to the pitch of the wind screaming through the piano wire bracing to judge her speed. In the co-pilot's seat, the navigator prepared the bombs. The targeting system was laughably primitive, a set of lines painted on the side of the wooden fuselage and a stopwatch. The navigator would lean far out of the open, freezing cockpit, looking directly down into the dark, lining up the target by eye. To the German infantrymen on the ground, the first sign of an attack was not a siren, but this ghostly, inexplicable sound. The wind rushing over the tightly stretched cotton canvas and wooden struts created a high-pitched, hollow hiss. To the highly superstitious and exhausted soldiers, the sound was uncannily similar to a straw broom sweeping through the air. It was a sound that paralyzed them with a primal, psychological terror. They whispered to each other in the dark, "The witches are flying." Before the soldiers could scramble for cover, before the anti-aircraft guns could redirect their fire, the sky would split open. With a sharp pull of a manual lever, the navigator released the bombs. Free of their heavy burden, the wooden biplane would suddenly leap upward, buoyed by the sudden loss of weight. The pilot would slam the throttle forward. The sudden rush of airspeed would spin the wooden propeller, forcing the cold 5-cylinder engine to cough, sputter, and roar back to life with a loud, defiant rattle. By the time the German searchlights could swing around to find the source of the devastation, the Po-2 was already climbing away, dissolving into the protective embrace of the Russian night. But for the pilots of the 588th, there was no time to celebrate. A single raid was just the beginning of an agonizing, endless night. Because the Po-2 could only carry a few bombs at a time, the crews had to fly multiple sorties to inflict meaningful damage. The moment a plane touched down on the dark, snowy runway, the ground crew would swarm it. In a matter of minutes, they would manually refuel the aircraft, strap new bombs to the wooden wings, and clear the ice from the control surfaces. The pilot and navigator would barely have time to drink a cup of hot tea before they were taxied back to the runway. On a single winter night, a single crew would fly between 15 and 18 grueling missions, living in a continuous, exhausting cycle of ice, fire, and absolute terror.
By the autumn of 1942, the German advance had ground to a brutal, agonizing halt in the ruins of Stalingrad and the frozen passes of the Caucasus. But for the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the true horror of the Russian campaign did not just occur during the blood-soaked daylight hours. The real nightmare began when the sun went down. Sleep was a luxury of the past. In the diaries of German infantrymen from this period, a recurring, frantic theme emerged, a desperate, almost animalistic fear of the night skies. One soldier wrote home, describing how the darkness was no longer a shield, but a suffocating trap. The constant, unpredictable visits of the Soviet biplanes meant that every tent, every trench, and every supply line was under constant threat of sudden, fiery eradication. The physical toll of the Russian winter was already breaking their bodies, but it was the relentless harassment of the 588th Regiment that was systematically dismantling their minds. What the German army was experiencing was a highly calculated campaign of tactical sleep deprivation. In the theater of modern warfare, sleep deprivation is recognized as a highly effective form of psychological torture. After 48 hours without restorative sleep, the human brain begins to misinterpret sensory data. The nervous system redlines, flooding the body with cortisol and adrenaline until the slightest sound triggers a violent, panic-induced reaction. Soldiers began to hallucinate, seeing phantom gliders in every passing cloud and mistaking the rustle of dry leaves for the dreaded hiss of canvas wings. They could not cook hot meals, they could not clean their weapons, and they could not rest their frozen feet. The German soldiers were caught in an inexorable trap of perpetual paranoia, knowing that the moment they closed their eyes, a silent wooden ghost could drop a fragmentation bomb directly through the roof of their shelter. As the psychological crisis deepened, German ground troops attempted to fight back with everything they had. They filled the night sky with walls of lead, firing rifles, heavy machine guns, and rapid-fire anti-aircraft cannons into the dark void. But they quickly discovered another maddening paradox of the Polikarpov Po-2. The plane was functionally immortal. Because the wings and fuselage were made of soft cotton canvas stretched over a flexible wooden frame, standard infantry bullets and shrapnel did not shatter the structure. Instead, the projectiles simply punched clean, tiny holes through the fabric and passed out the other side, leaving the lift-generating surfaces of the biplane completely intact. Unless a German bullet managed to strike the pilot directly, or pierce the single unarmored engine block, the wooden kite would simply absorb the damage and keep flying. It was like trying to shoot down a spider web. The frustration within the Luftwaffe High Command eventually boiled over into outright desperation. To motivate his increasingly demoralized troops, General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring issued an extraordinary, unprecedented decree. The German High Command announced that any German soldier or pilot who successfully shot down a Polikarpov Po-2 would automatically be awarded the Iron Cross. This was the Reich's highest military decoration for bravery, an honor typically reserved for fighter aces who had downed dozens of Allied bombers, or infantrymen who had single-handedly destroyed entire tank platoons. Now, the German war machine was offering its most prestigious medal for the destruction of a fragile wooden crop duster. It was the ultimate unspoken admission of defeat.
The high-tech Luftwaffe was being completely humiliated by teenage girls flying outdated trainers. In a desperate bid to win those Iron Crosses, the Luftwaffe deployed their elite night fighter squadrons, equipping advanced aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-110 with early airborne radar systems. But these high-tech interceptors were completely useless against the Night Witches. The Bf-110's radar relied on detecting metal masses. The wooden Po-2 presented no radar signature at all. Furthermore, the German night fighter pilots, flying at speeds of over 250 miles per hour, could not spot the dark, silent biplanes weaving through the treetops. If a German pilot did manage to catch a glimpse of a Po-2, his attempt to slow down to line up a shot would instantly result in an aerodynamic stall, sending his multi-million-mark fighter crashing into the Russian forest, while his wooden target drifted lazily away. It was during this period of psychological collapse that the German soldiers gave their tormentors the name that would immortalize them in the annals of military history. They did not call them pilots or soldiers or even enemies. They called them Nachthexen, the Night Witches. The name was born out of a toxic mixture of genuine terror, grudging respect, and a desperate need to explain how these young women could consistently bypass the most advanced defenses on Earth. To the shivering German soldier in his muddy trench, the whisper of the canvas wings overhead was no longer just the sound of a primitive airplane. It was the chilling, unmistakable sound of a witch's broom sweeping through the heavens, carrying with it the cold, unyielding promise of death. On May 8, 1945, the Nazi war machine collapsed into unconditional surrender. For the women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the long, bloody road that had begun in the terrified, retreating days of 1941 had finally reached its end. They had fought their way from the plains of the Kuban, across the Crimean Peninsula, through the burning cities of Poland, and straight into the heart of the Reich itself. During their 3 years of continuous combat, these young women had flown over 23,000 individual sorties. They had dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs on the invading forces. But the true measure of their victory was not written in the tonnage of explosives, but in the survival of their bond. They had started the war as mocked, under-equipped schoolgirls. They ended it as the most battle-hardened, elite unit in the entire Soviet Air Force. But for the Night Witches, victory brought a jarring, bittersweet transition. Just months after the war ended, the Soviet High Command, still deeply patriarchal despite the wartime propaganda, made a swift and unceremonious decision. The 588th Regiment was officially disbanded. The canvas-covered biplanes that had carried them through the gates of hell were rolled into old storage hangars, and the pilots were quietly sent home. There was no grand parade down Moscow's Gorky Street specifically for them. Girls who had spent years dodging lethal flak, piloting burning aircraft with their bare hands, and burying their closest friends in shallow graves, suddenly found themselves back in civilian life. They returned to half-destroyed villages to become teachers, clerks, and factory workers. The skies that had once defined their every waking second were suddenly, agonizingly silent. Yet, history could not erase what they had achieved. Out of the raw, icy crucible of the Eastern Front, 24 pilots of the regiment were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's absolute highest military decoration. They became the most highly decorated female unit in military history. Women like Nadezhda Popova, Irina Sebrova, and Natalia Mechlin became legends, their names spoken in hushed, reverent tones by historians worldwide. They had proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that courage, tactical brilliance, and psychological resilience were not the exclusive domain of men. They had taken a machine designed to spray pesticide over potato fields and transformed it into an instrument of pure, unadulterated terror.
But the story of the Laughable canvas plane did not end in 1945. In one of the most bizarre twists in aviation history, the Polikarpov Po-2 was called to war once again.
During the Korean War in the early 1950s, the North Korean Air Force deployed the aging biplanes against the highly advanced, jet-powered military of the United States. The Americans, equipped with state-of-the-art radar, supersonic interceptors, and devastating anti-aircraft systems, laughed at the old wooden planes just as the Germans had a decade prior. They nicknamed the night-raiding biplanes Bed-Check Charlies. But the irony of history repeated itself with brutal precision. The American jet fighters were too fast and too heavily laden to successfully target an aircraft that cruised at 90 miles per hour. On several occasions, U.S. pilots attempted to slow their multi-million-dollar jets down to target the wooden pests, only to experience catastrophic aerodynamic stalls. In one legendary engagement, a high-tech F-94 Starfire night fighter stalled out and crashed while trying to intercept a lumbering Po-2. The wooden crop duster had claimed a jet-age kill without ever firing a single shot. The United States military was forced to realize what the German Wehrmacht had learned at the cost of their sanity. You cannot defeat an enemy that is too slow to be caught and too quiet to be heard. Nikolai Polikarpov's simple biplane was produced in staggering numbers, over 30,000 units, making it one of the most produced aircraft in human history. It was a machine built out of poverty, designed for the dirt, and mocked by the masters of industrial engineering. But its legacy is a timeless reminder of a fundamental truth of warfare. Military dominance is not merely a matter of horsepower, aluminum, and advanced radar. It is defined by the spirit, the ingenuity, and the sheer, unyielding defiance of those who occupy the cockpit. The Germans began the war laughing at a canvas sewing machine with wings, but by the end they realized that the wind whistling through those canvas wings was the sound of their own undoing. They laughed at the canvas plane until the night witches taught them to fear the silence. The saga of the night witches remains one of the most remarkable anomalies in military history, a stark, unforgettable reminder that ingenuity and human will can completely dismantle technological supremacy. But now, we want to hear from you. Do you think modern military planners, with their multi-million-dollar stealth jets and digital sensors, have forgotten the lessons of low-tech psychological warfare? Or was the success of the Po-2 a unique miracle of timing that could never be replicated in today's skies? Share your opinions in the comments below. We read every single one. If you want to uncover more gripping, untold stories of military history, make sure to hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell, and join our community. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next episode.